next author is Robert James Bridge. Obviously, I'm not him. Mr. Bridge couldn't join us today, so I'm presenting in his stead. Robert, known fondly as Bob, lives on the southern coast of the United Kingdom, where he spends most of his days writing. Bob has 8 books on Smashwords, 3 of which were published by Blazing Heart Publishing, and 1 is currently with Pennant Publication. Here are some words Bob wanted to share with all of you today. And while the voice is mine, the words are his. Before I go ahead and explain my writing career to date, I wonder if you might allow me to introduce myself to you. You could say I began writing many years ago at school, since I was always jotting ideas down. As the years went on, I found my love of writing increased, but I did not want to become an author of a certain genre. In other words, I wanted to write about real-life stories, as well as crime, historical fiction, romance, and whatever else came into my head. Please don't say you were born to be a writer, as this is not true. Rather, it is something I have always enjoyed doing, even though the pay is not fantastic and it's hard work focusing on being creative with so many other things going on in the world. But focus I did, and the reward of seeing my premiere tome published were all I needed. Writing is not an easy occupation, and rejection is something you have to take on the chin. In the early days, when I thought I would never see any of my books published, I began with a notepad and pen, writing down a title and sketching out a cover. For me, this forward planning is an important part of the process. Each day I added to my story in my spare time, getting to know every character in my book. This was all before I began the actual story. Then it was down to my imagination as I pursued my book. I figured out it had to have a decent word count, even though this is not what sells the book. Publishers are fussy and want a certain amount of words in each book. After months of writing, it was time to attack my computer and type up my story, wary all the time of spelling and paragraph breaks and, of course, how big I wanted each and every chapter to be. At the age of almost 83, I hope I can now call myself a published author, and, even if I've made very little money from all my work, I consider it to be an ongoing, enjoyable project. We all imagine ourselves as successful authors and pray one day our dreams will come true. However, there is much satisfaction to be had just from being published, and who knows what's around the corner. I figure if you love what you do, never give up, or as the saying goes, he who dares wins. I do find, though, sometimes it's fine to pack up writing for the day and return when your imagination points you in the direction on your computer. Writing is an enjoyable and sometimes incredibly rewarding experience, especially when you see your book or books not only in the shops, but also having readers comment on them. I have had 8 books published, along with a 4-book crime series, plus short stories in magazines, and I am awaiting the publication of my latest book. So as you can see, writing is hard work. Even after you have written your book, it is still not finished until you or your publisher edits it, checks the formatting, and decides whether it's a viable proposition to publish or not. Keep up the good work, and I repeat, if you love what you do, never let anyone deter you from your writing. Like any other trade, it is something you learn from, and as the years go by, you find you become more knowledgeable in terms of attracting publishers and readers. You will start finding and correcting your own mistakes so that you can send in near-perfect stories that will have readers thirsting for more. I wish you all the very best in your writing journey, and hope to see your books published in the near future. Yours in writing, Robert James Bridge. You can contact Robert at robert.bridge@blueyonder.co.uk. And now for an excerpt from Kinmel Revisited by Robert James Bridge. Introduction. Today, one could perhaps be forgiven for not noticing the small village of Bottlewoodden, situated on the North Wales coast. But back in the year 1919, just after the war to end all wars, another was about to begin in the shape of a riot by some 400 men in the Canadian Expeditionary Force stationed in the camp adjacent to the village, and indeed, Bottlewoodden was on the front page of almost every tabloid newspaper in the country. The year is 1990, and I, Robert Bridge, known fondly as Bob, and my wife Lillian, had decided after 15 years working for a credit card company that it was time to maybe live near our aged parents in Abergele, another village not far from Bottlewoodden. It has to be said that because of family ties, we returned south at a later date. Meanwhile, we purchased an old Victorian house for the challenge of bringing it up to modern-day standards. The house had been built around 1890 and stood in its own, ground away from the hubbub of everyday life. Our first chore was to have central heating installed, even though each and every room had an old Victorian fireplace. We then set about the many other chores that needed doing. It came about one day whilst Lillian was preparing lunch. I decided it was time to clear the attic. Now the attic, like the rest of the house, had not seen the light of day for many years. As I made my way through the tangled web, I came across loads of old junk, which included an old box in the corner. As I brushed away the dust, I was confronted by the insignia of a regiment that escaped me. A regiment from many years ago. Curiosity got the better of me, so I shone my torch on the badge, brushed the dust off, and proceeded to open the box. Lo and behold, and much to my surprise, inside were a set of old manuscripts that were damp and almost unreadable. I found a crate to sit on, and with the aid of my torch began to read of a story that had me mesmerized by the heading which read Kinmel Revisited. Now I had heard of Kinmel and the many stories that were told in the public houses, and of how an army officer and his wife had lodged in Abergele in 1919 during the riot at the camp. Suddenly it became clear as this fascinating story unfolded before me that we had in fact purchased the house and the manuscripts that had been written by him. Manuscripts that had remained untouched in the box all those years. I must say, even with my torch, much of the writing had been erased, but the entire story was legible. Mesmerized by the story, I felt myself being taken back to an era long forgotten, to trenches and men screaming out in pain, and to Kinmel Camp and the riot that Captain George Sawley witnessed. "Bob, your lunch is ready!" Lillian's voice brought me back to reality. "Okay, love, be down in a second," I shouted as I placed my find back in the box. Leaving it in the attic, I went downstairs only to be confronted by Lillian. "What the hell have you been doing all this time?" she said as I stood open-mouthed. "Lillian, you are not going to believe this, but we have purchased a house in which an army officer and his wife lodged during the riot at Kinmel in 1919. And guess what? The officer wrote down the story and it's in the attic. Jesus, it isn't a treasure, but it sure makes fascinating reading." That evening I brought the box down and we tried to compile the story of the Kinmel Camp riot and of how George came to be sent to Kinmel after the war. The next day we took a trip over to Bottlewood to the Church of St. Margaret's to see firsthand the graves of 5 young men, who it seems died during the fracas of bullets and bayonet wounds. I then took my find to the local historical society, and they said, although faded, it was a genuine manuscript, and maybe one day a book will tell the story of the riot at Kinmel. We continued our chores and cleared out the attic, but never came across any more papers. It seems the badge was of the artillery, and we had the job of keeping our find in good condition until, at a later date, I decided I wanted to write a book on the riot at Kinmel, perhaps in memory of those 5 young men. Prelude. The frantic knocking on the door awakened me from the sleep I was trying to catch up on. I stumbled to my feet, belatedly realizing that I was not still in the trenches, as the horrors of my dream seemed to indicate. The knocking continued, so I pulled open the door to be confronted by torrential rain and a half-drowned corporal who was obviously in a state of near panic. "Captain Sawley, sir," he stuttered. "You must come at once. The Canadians have raided the canteen and barricaded themselves in. They are well on the way to being drunk, sir, and the leader of the men is saying that if someone in authority does not tell them when they are going home, they will bring the camp to its knees. They must be armed, sir, because they are threatening to shoot anyone who comes within range if their demands aren't met." Without waiting for a reply, the corporal saluted me and dashed off into the muck of the rain-soaked field we used as a parade ground, although it must be said that it looked more like the desolate wastes of the front than any parade ground, and sounded like it too as sporadic gunfire echoed around the camp. As I watched the man disappear into the gloom, I realized that this trouble was all mine. There was no one else to turn to, but I prided myself that the Sawley name was one of honor, and I, Captain George Sawley, would face this as I had faced the Germans at the front, with all the courage I could muster. It was early March and the cold winter was taking its toll. Kinmel Park Camp, sited on the outskirts of the village of Bottlewood in North Wales, was in the grip of a flu epidemic.